Hello, everyone. I am here today, ending our Friday afternoon to talk about a little bit about movies, specifically witchcraft in movies, and even more specifically, how modern witches, occultists, people that actually practice have affected and influenced movies over 100 years. So we're going to get started. This is just one thread that I talk about in my book, and we only have about 20 minutes because I want to take questions. So we're going to dive in and go really quick through a taste of what this looks like, okay? So let's get started real quick. I'm going to flip myself over here to Lights, Camera, Witchcraft. We're going to start 100 years ago, a little over, during the silent era when movies were more or less short, black and white, and silent. And we're going to start there because during this period of time, the occult was growing in popularity, or actually was already pretty popular, generally speaking. Other things that were adjacent to that as well, tarot, Ouija, etc. And it found its way into the early silent films. The first stop on this tour is The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, 1910, the first cinematic adaptation of Bound's classic story. Now, the film itself is not really reflective of any type of occult practice. However, I wanted to point this film out because Baum himself was a spiritualist. He and his wife and his mother-in-law were all members of the Theosophist Society. And when he was a journalist and a publisher, he did write a lot of essays that reflected that type of ideology. Now, this film was not made by him. He had sold the rights because he was bankrupt. So it really doesn't reflect necessarily the spiritualism that you might find hidden within the actual books. But it's worth noting because this is one of the most influential texts on American witch films. All of the Oz films and adaptations after this move further and further away from the spirit of his original books. Most adaptations after 1939 are adaptations or derivatives of MGM's movie and not his books. So we don't mention it again after this, but this is a nice little place to start. The next movie we're going to stop at, the next stop on this tour, so to speak, is The Mysteries of Myra, 1916. Now, The Mysteries of Myra was a serial. There was a series of episodes that you'd go to the movies to see with the same characters and storyline, similar to television today. So this particular one was about a young girl who was being perpetually pursued by the Black Order, who wanted her inheritance, to kill her for her inheritance. Her father had been a member of the Black Order. Now, the Black Order was designed to be Aleister Crowley's groups and his practice, designed directly from that. And the actual Grand Master of the Black Order was a direct copy of Crowley himself on purpose. And you can see the picture of Crowley on the screen. I believe it's to your left, it's to my left. And the Grand Master is on the right bottom. And you can see the similarities, the visual similarities. Now, this was done on purpose. The creator and storyteller, so to speak, the people who informed the writers, was Hereward Carrington, who was who himself was a spiritualist, traveled the world studying magic, folk magic, all kinds of occult practices. He was fascinated by Crowley, and he was a paranormal investigator. So this came through in this story. This is a direct influence, okay? What's interesting to note, and it's important going forward, is that there's a witch at the center of the screen, but she's a fantasy witch. At this time in the American mind, in the cultural ideology, witchcraft was fantasy, fiction, silliness and stuff that was in children's literature. Occult was something the audience can practice. That was real magic. And that separation is vital to understanding the representation of witchcraft in early cinema, early American cinema. So now we're going to move on past the silent era into the golden era. This is the time you think of when you think of old Hollywood, okay? The golden era ran from around the 20s. The studio system was built then. into the 60s, okay? So it's a long period of time, and it's marked by extreme censorship. There was a code that every mainstream film had to go through in order to find their audience, so to speak. And the code controlled what could be and what could not be put on screen. So there really was no influence from modern witches, occultists, or little to none during this period of time. So we don't really have much to talk about. Again, I said The Wizard of Oz moved further from Baum's original text, so we're not going to mention that. But there is one film I'd like to talk about, which is pretty cool. It's Macbeth, 1948, an adaptation of Shakespeare's play, which many of you have read and know, very familiar with. It was directed by and created by Welles. He loved this play, Orson Welles, that is, and that's him right there. He stars as Macbeth. And he conceived of the witches in this film as druidic priestesses. And the tension in the film, he wanted it to be a tension between the old religion, which he represented as witchcraft, nature, women, and the new religion, which he represented as Christianity, and structure and masculinity. And it is in there, but it's very hard to see, okay? Audiences missed it. And in the 1960s, Orson Welles did an interview and he laments that. He didn't understand why people missed it, but they did. But what's nice about this and why I mention it is that it's very rare that witches are represented as druidic priestesses, and it's an important little detail from Hollywood's golden era. We're going to move out of that now. As I said, I'm going quick to New Hollywood. We're now in the late 60s, okay? So what happened is the production code gets dissolved. Hollywood films are now artistic expressions, legally speaking even, and no longer products of an industry. So we get a whole rash of new stuff. The horror genre is reborn in ways it had never been before. And what I like, and of course, incorporating witchcraft, and what I like to say when I usually do these talks is that all hell broke loose. And I mean that quite literally on the screen. Satanic witches were now everywhere in horror, right? And one of the things that's important with respect to this talk is that this happened at the same time as the Cultural Revolution, and they weren't independent necessarily. So what we have there embedded in the Cultural Revolution is the emergence of the modern witchcraft movement, the emergence of the modern pagan movement, okay? Some of the books that you find on the shelves about witchcraft were first released in the late 60s and early 70s. We're talking about Raymond Buckland, Paul Hewson, Gardner's books were finding themselves on the shelves in America at this time for the first time in many cases. You also had the Church of Satan as a parallel, and books produced there. And Hollywood was very aware of all this stuff. They were aware of the magazines and the growth of this new invisible movement of magic and the occult and the interest. So of course, the stuff found its way into the horror film. And these horror films were not necessarily top films. A lot of them were B films, and they're really fun to watch. A couple examples here. I've got Necromancy. There's Orson Welles again. And on the right side of the screen is Mark of the Witch. And if you are a practitioner of magic, witchcraft, you will recognize some of the phrases that are being used in these films, okay? You find things like blessed be, so mote be, calling the quarters, priestess, goddess, coven. These words were rarely found before this time. And they're directly out of these texts, these books that are now being produced, okay? Let's see, Necromancy, just as an aside, Raymond Buckland was an advisor on that. And he was somewhat involved with trying to work on other films as well. One other text that is actually the most recurs the most in these films, is found the most in these films, is Mastering Witchcraft by Paul Hewson. Here's two examples. You'll find spells directly lifted out of those texts in these movies. Season of the Witch or Hungry Wives, it's the same film, also called Jack's Wife. Okay, it had 3 titles. Midnight Offerings, 1981. It's a precursor to The Craft. You also find his spells in that. Paul Hewson was a screenwriter by trade. He was part of the Hollywood community to a degree, so it's not surprising that his text found its way into more films. He also was the creator, advisor, I believe he might have done some of the writing on a show called Tucker's Witch, which aired in the early 80s, I think maybe 1 or 2 seasons. Some of you may have actually watched it at that time. So we're now going to move to on into the 80s, what we know as the Satanic Panic period, which was a backlash against the 70s, was a backlash against the cultural movements of that period of time. But what was happening along with that is that the pagan community was growing. Pagan community was producing more books, was producing more material, was producing more associations coming together, and they started to fight back. And you see you see the pagans fighting back on a lot of different media, not just film. But there's one point here I like to bring up, one moment, which is really important for pagan history, in fact. There was a show on, ABC was planning a show called The Craft, which was going to be more or less what you would expect during the Satanic Panic, a coven of evil witches that worship Satan are stealing babies, something like that, some narrative of that kind. And the pagan community was not going to have any of it. So what they did, led by Circle Sanctuary, Reverend Selena Fox and other clergy from Circle, led a letter writing campaign to stop the production of that show. And it worked. ABC stopped. Okay, they ended the production. But what they did was they took the pilot and they turned it into a made-for-television movie, changed the name to Save a Child, and it aired in 1991. And you can still see that. But this is an example of the pagan community's direct interaction with Hollywood or television, and in an attempt to change the representation of witches on screen. And even more interesting is that that action launched Lady Liberty League, which is still around today fighting for pagan rights. Now we're going to move on. What happens after the Satanic Panic? What happens in the ashes of all of that mess and all of that representation is Wicca rises out of those ashes, so to speak, and becomes this sort of okay version of magic. Wicca is now being defined as good magic and as religion, which is the first time this actually happens. In addition, it gets linked to this bigger girl power movement that was happening at the time. Think Sabrina the Teenage Witch, Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Willow, Charmed, okay? This is part of a girl power movement where girls can be anything and they can even be witches. So we're going to look at what happens here. There's this sort of redefining of witchcraft and magic. With the emergence of Wicca as this sort of religion and the language that's being, and the rhetoric that's being rolled around in media, you have, of course, the craft, practical magic, charm. These are 3 examples. You also have pagan guides being invited onto the set for the first time, or not for a long time. Buckland was on the set for the earlier movie, but you have them being these priestesses, Wiccans, being invited on set to help with the language to make it right, okay? And Blair Witch, also Charmed, all of these had some form of consultancy going on. So you not only had this link between Wicca, good magic, and girl power, you also had the pagan guides coming on influencing the way they were represented, influencing the way witchcraft was being presented. You also had new rhetoric around what Wicca was. Wicca is, excuse me, a religion. And we have these shows, okay, demonstrating that, redefining and explaining that. And these are all law-based shows. You've got Boston Legal, JAG, CSI, The Mentalist, Bones, which is, there's no picture here, all do shows usually in October where there's a crime, people think it's a witch or an occultist, when, oh, wait a minute, it's not. And of course, heroes sweep in and explain everything to the audience, and the witch is vindicated and the bad guy is caught. So you sort of have that in their own narratives. So we start to see this language that Wicca is an actual religion, okay? And this is all attributed to the growth of the community and the increase in the number of books and the increase in visibility of the community itself. So where are we now? What happens from then, 2000s, early 2000s, to now? So what I like to talk about, and I'm going to try to do this real quick because I got 4 minutes and I really want to take some questions, is that with the birth of social media and the internet, not the birth of the internet, but the growth of the internet, the pagan community, witchcraft communities have not only been able to grow, they've also been able, and this is the important part, to diversify. So witchcraft was no longer just Wicca. Witchcraft was no longer just one thing or two things. We see this diversification. And with the diversification, we also see a renegotiation of meaning on the screen. Within these narratives, we start to see a pondering, so to speak, of what magic is. What is witchcraft? What does it mean to be a witch? Who is a witch? What is magic? And so we start to see things getting turned on their head. We start to see the things that we knew being re-examined to see if they were actually right. Okay, so for example, real quick here, Beautiful Creatures looks at good and evil and what that really means in relation to power and magic and family. The Love Witch is an example of how magic and witchcraft are linked to a woman's power, especially a source of empowerment for people who have experienced trauma or have been oppressed. And also it gives you this discussion, it presents this discussion, we may not like what she's doing, the witch, but we understand why she does it. And it's the same as you see that in Maleficent, and then the show Salem are another examples of that. In Game of Thrones and the Red Witch, we see, again, religion coming into play, similar to Sabrina, this discussion of witchcraft in relation to religious meaning. We also see a look at women and their relationship to power and beauty and sexuality, and the negotiation and understanding of age and aging. These are discussions, they're not absolutes. These films are considering them, okay? And in this last one, it's a new film. I don't know if anyone's seen it, or it's an excellent horror film called The Spell. This has an all-black cast. Another change, that witches don't only look one way. And not only that, the witchcraft is a type of folk magic here. It's not it's not Wicca. It's not the magic of the 1950s fiction. Okay, this is another type of representation, a new representation of real magic happening here. So I want to end here on this film, The Craft Legacy, and I put legacy up because the film itself incorporates a lot of what I'm talking about here, this renegotiation of the meaning of the witch and witchcraft. So you have here girl power, like we saw in the 90s, right? Witchcraft here is empowering these 4 young women that are in high school. However, they are also finding unique aspects of magic, unique powers that bring them together as one, sort of like in a what's the My Little Pony kind of way. Friendship is magic. It has that kind of feel to it, but this is more serious. Obviously, it's not a cartoon. You also have the witches represented in different ways. 3 of the women are do identify as women of color. The woman who is on the right is a trans woman, the actress is, as well as the character. So you see a lot of, like I said, redefining of a witch, the diversification of the meaning of magic, witchcraft, and the witch itself, and what's allowable expands out. And in addition, and it's quick last note about this film, also incorporates guides. So you have not only these films reflecting the diversification of the witchcraft community through the exposure of social media and the internet, allowing everyone to see it, we also are seeing, again, continuing use of consultants, and even more than just consulting on the script itself or other elements of production. They actually were doing spells to help the production itself in terms of if they did magic, for example, on screen, the witches were there to make sure the magic was done right and safely. So you see, now we have modern witches and occultists actually working not only to influence what you see, but also working on an ideological level and also working behind the scenes, and magic is part of the production itself. So this was a very, very quick speed run, let's say, through a very interesting topic that actually there's a lot more detail, and you can find it in my book. There's your plug, A Lights, Camera, Witchcraft. It's going to be out October 2021. And this, again, is one story that I talk about in this film. Sorry, not in this film, in this book. It's only one of the threads that I go through. I talk about genres. I talk about gender play and gender power. In context, I talk about religion and how that influenced everything, as well as politics, and a host of other things, because this is a very complex topic and it's fascinating. How did the witch arrive at Hollywood in the around 1900, and how was she pursued throughout and represented to today? What made her change, and why did she change, and how did that work? And one last thing, and what I found in doing this study is that although there are male witches, and I love to talk about them too, the most witches are women, and that the story of the American witch parallels the story of the American woman in many ways. And so you have a really interesting tale that she's wants to tell us. And so now I would like to go over, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and take some, or actually I'll just flip over here, I think, and take some questions now. So let's see, I think we're going to get some questions from anybody about movies. You could ask questions about ones that I didn't talk about. This is your chance to just, share. Everybody watches. What's your favorite movie? I'd love to just hear that too. What's your favorite witch movie? Throw it up there, because we all have one, right? So I'm seeing from Jennifer DeVoe Gillis, have you seen the TV series Motherland Fort Salem? Yeah, that actually, I watched last season. I believe it was, I believe it is coming back just like this week or something, the second season, or maybe it's early July, I can't remember. But what's interesting about that is that there's a goddess, it's goddess worship there, and it's totally turns the entire concept of witchcraft it turns the whole culture around, really, because it's really a matriarchal culture. So it's a very interesting show. Simon King and the Witches, Barbara says, a 1969 is one of the few with a lead male, and that is true. And there's Wicca in that too. It's one of those 1970s horror films. Do you know any movies based on Lovecraft's work that are notable? I actually talk about two of them that are from the, I think, early 90s, and their names escape me right now. I think one's to Catch a Killer or something. They are notable. I do talk about them in my book, but like I said, for some reason their names are escaping me right now, and I don't have my list. Let's see. So what advice, Moon Chica says, so what advice would you give a screenwriter that wants to write a witch movie? That's a really good question. It really depends, because we love the fantasy and the fiction, and as much as we love the realistic representations. So I would say if someone was not a witch and wanted to write a movie about what we might say is real witchcraft, they should probably have a consult just to make sure they're getting it right. And I also, and even if you're doing witchcraft as fiction, purely fiction, it might be nice to have somebody to make sure you don't do anything that is now considered offensive. Yes, practical magic. I see people typing practical magic. Bell Book and Candle. Of course, Bell Book and Candle is one of my all-time favorites. It was made during the Golden Era, and that has its own interesting story behind it. Do you approve of Sabrina the Teenage Witch having a devil? I think Sabrina the Teenage Witch, it's Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, the latest version. That one is really interesting because, again, that one is, like I said, the renegotiating what witchcraft means in relation to religion. And I do a little bit of that and talk about a little bit of that in my book. I don't have a problem with it, honestly, because I think it's a really discussing, it's really challenging the boundaries of what we know as good and bad, of evil and evil and good, good and bad, whatever. It's really challenging those boundaries and breaking them, because no character in that is completely bad. No character in that is completely good. And it's making us question exactly what you just asked. Is it okay? Is the devil okay? And so it's really challenging us in that way. Let's see, we got The Witches with Angelica Houston. That's another great one. I'm watching people throwing up their favorite movies. Burn Witch Burn. Yes, the book Conjure Wife. There is a number of books. There's a number of movies based on Conjure Wife. I mentioned A Weird Woman. That one is. And there's a number of those. Midnight Offerings has been one of Brandy's favorites, along with Bell Book and Candle. Let's see, here's a question. Have any witches done movies about our own craft, fiction or documentary? Yes, there are. And there are documentaries that are out there that were, and witches have been part of. I know there was a witch that was a writer on the Sabrina show. We also have, I believe, a filmmaker that's watching. I think I saw her name go by, and she did one in Canada called Witty Pagans. And that one, I don't know if it's available where at this point. Maybe if she hears me, she can put it up in the screen on the in the chat. But that one looks at pagans in Canada. So that's another. Most of these are going to be documentaries. Let's see, Bed Knobs and Broomsticks. Harry Potter. Now, I'd like to just mention that my book is on American film and American television. So I mention Harry Potter because it's influenced, but I really don't get into that. And that's the same as Bed Knobs and Broomsticks. It was a Disney film produced, but it really was a British film. So I don't get into that. Some other ones, yes, The Last Keepers, very, very positive pagan presentation. Absolutely correct. That was a comment from Laura Tempest Zackroft. Let's see, we've got some other great ones. Moon Chica says The Last Witch Hunter, Hansel and Gretel Witch Hunters. Well, that's a totally different topic, and I didn't get into those films because those are a little bit, they don't have necessarily positive representations of witchcraft, even if you enjoy them. And there's no reason to say if you enjoy a film, you enjoy a film. So let's see how much time. I only have one more question. Anyone else? Anyone? And one last question before we go. Let's see, a documentary about 3 or 4 witches. Laurie Cabot was one of them. I'm sure that's the case, and I didn't study documentaries, so in my head I don't have the names of all of them. But there's a ton. Circle Sanctuary did them, and a number of different groups did them, especially in the 80s. Yes, Pam said Rosemary's Baby, absolutely classic. Carrie, there's so many good ones out there. So I'm just going to say real quick before we go, again, my book is Lights, Camera, Witchcraft. And each chapter is devoted to a different segment in time. So you'll walk through time, and I have a list of films at the back of each chapter. So as you read the book, you can actually watch the films. And that's the best way to do it, I tell you, because there are so many good ones to watch out there. And I guess that's it. So I'm going to say goodbye, and thank you very much for coming today. Thank you very much for coming in to this LlewellynCon this year. There have been so many great presentations, and we've got, I think, one more day of it. So enjoy, have a wonderful weekend, watch some witchcraft movies, and reach out if you want to. You can find me on social media, all the usual places, Twitter, Facebook. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great weekend.